Hello everybody, Josh12 back here again with another video, and today I bring you a first ever documentary review. I haven't really done most reviews for documentaries, but this specific documentary that premiered yesterday was very moving, very complex, and very cultivating to me. And of course that has a lot to do with the source material, which of course is Kurt Cobain, Montage of Heck. Of course it premiered yesterday, May 4th, at HBO, HBO's newest documentary, and of course is directed by Brett Morgan, and it tells the story of Kurt Cobain's, I guess, from his own, artwork and audio recordings of his rise to fame and his kind of fall with life, if you will, and it's kind of just overall just documenting his personal thoughts on things, his speaking through people that he knew, talking about him as a person and him versus his famous iconic idol-like personality, if you will, and just the various other complex things that went along with him as a person and him as a famous entity. But nonetheless, I don't do documentary reviews, but I do really enjoy Nirvana. I really grew up really enjoying Nirvana's music. I really enjoyed what Kurt Cobain's lyrics had to say, and I just liked it as I just really enjoyed Kurt Cobain and Nirvana in and of itself. I've already pointed this out in multiple videos prior that I'm obviously a huge Nirvana fan, but nonetheless, with that being said, let's just get right down into this review. Nonetheless, if you've not seen the documentary, I please encourage most people to check it out, of course, because this review may contain spoilers if you've not seen the documentary already. But nonetheless, I'm pretty sure most have seen it already because it has premiered in other places before. It's had its little limited release in theaters, if I'm not mistaken, and it also premiered in Sundance last year or earlier this year, if I'm not mistaken, as well. So it's been seen across the world already for most of the part, but it was just finally premiered on HBO yesterday, so which is, I guess, the only way I was ever going to see it. So nonetheless, let's just get right down into this review of Kurt Cobain, Montage of Heck. Of course, this documentary is already being called the definitive Cobain documentary, and I think that has a lot to do with the fact that this documentary succeeds in other places that other docs didn't really get to, which is showing off Kurt Cobain as a person and letting him really tell his own story through his work. And that's the interesting thing about this documentary, that it's really more complex than most documentaries, where it's less about the people who knew him and the experiences they had with him, like most documentaries, and letting them tell the story of him, but it's more or less just his music, his lyrics, his personal journals, his artwork, and little animations that were created solely to recreate audio recordings of what was going on with him at the time, really tell the story of his rise to becoming probably one of the most famous rock stars of all time. So I think that was the more interesting aspect of the show, where you don't necessarily get to have, shot for shot everything that happens to him, but you get shot for shot things that you don't know, things that may or may not have happened, and things that really intrigued us as, fans of Nirvana, which I thought was a great approach that Morgan actually went with it. And I think a lot of that has to go with the fact that he had access to things that a lot of people don't get access to, which is, of course, his personal stuff from various audio tapes and various other type of archives kind of, situations that, the family owns, the Cobain family or what have you, which a lot of that has to do with the family's cooperation with the film itself, which I think, once again, made the film a lot better, because usually with documentaries, you hear from either, the band's side of things, or, famous people's side of things. There's not really a lot of that in there. A lot of it, once again, has a lot to do with the family's perception of who he was and and what he became later on, and mostly Kurt. It's mostly Kurt saying what he thinks, and I think that was a beautiful choice to go with. It's so artistically indie, but because it has this huge backing, it felt like a legitimate movie, which I really enjoy. Like the animated sequences of his life, like him telling, his own personal issues with, his first time allegedly committing suicide, and him allegedly trying to lose his virginity simultaneously at the same time, was so interesting and so very, like, I don't know if it was good to hear that. It was so, and that goes a lot with a lot of things that Brett Morgen put into the documentary. Like, there's sequences where you can see that Kurt, once he was married with Courtney, and when he had his child Francis, where he's obviously doped up on heroin and on drugs, and you're like, this is the guy that when you're a kid you idolized because of how good his music was, but then you see him as a person and it kind of changes your perception of who this person was, because when you see him as the famous person or as the idol that you see him as or what he was, it's a complete 180 of how you see him in this film, where you see like the person who grew up where no one loved him versus the person who grew up where everybody loved him, and it was kind of, the story of him as a person versus the story that people created for him is completely 180, which I really enjoyed. Like, it's kind of just, it's a new, awakening of like, wow, this person was the complete 180 of who I really expected him to be. He was actually really loved by his family. And yes, he had his hard moments with, his parents' divorce and what have you and everything that led up to it, but he was a very loved child. And that, I think, really, I guess, didn't gel with what he really wanted to be or what have you, and then that kind of moved into what he later became. And then you lead up into his famous, his famous realities, which was also very interesting, because you find out that, he was a guy that went from obscurity to being ultra famous, and I guess I want to say really loved it, but at the same time, I guess didn't know how to deal with it specifically. And then you have the junkie aspect of it, where you're like, oh my god. Like, you see that him losing a lot with his personal issues with his wife or his child has a lot to do with the drugs, and you kind of get pissed off at him about the drugs, which is really interesting, because a lot of this happens, granted, years ago. Like, this happened like 2 decades ago, but for some reason when you watch it now, it's like, it's almost like it's happening again, and you're like, how could you, this person that, a lot of people appreciate and saw as an idol and saw as, a spokesperson for an entire generation, if you will, and you're doing drugs and you're like handling your child, you're like, it's kind of like seeing the crackheads who drop off their kids in the middle of the street when you see in the news in the morning, the morning news of like, oh, crackhead, kills their child. You're witnessing that through home videos of Kurt and Courtney like dealing with Francis. It's almost like cringeworthy. Oh my god, it's really intense of a documentary to watch, and it's very, very personal. And I think a lot of that has to do with the artistic route, and a lot of it has to do with Kurt Cobain's personal tapes of himself and personal home videos of him and his family dealing with things that I don't think were really meant for the wide masses, but because of the access that Brett Morgen had within this documentary, I think worked to his advantage. And personally, I really enjoyed the documentary. It was very complex. It was very, very intense. It was very artistic. I loved the visuals. I found the new kind of information that we have of this iconic rock star was very interesting, and complete 180 of how I really saw him as a person prior to watching this documentary, which I thought was awesome, because it's good to have heroes, but then it's good to know and realize when your heroes are really human and have a lot of fuck-up moments. It's really interesting to find that. And a lot of it is not a good thing, but I think after so much time has passed from the point where he died in the 90s to now, where I think it's a good thing to see it regardless of how you may or may not have felt back in the day. So at the end of the day, I personally really enjoyed the documentary. I don't want to go too in depth with it because I don't want to spoil it for people. I really encourage people to check it out. It's being called the definitive Kurt Cobain documentary, and at this point in time, I think I would actually go that route and call it that. It's very moving, it's very intense, very, very well done, and I just loved how it was less of a conventional documentary of people talking about the shot for shot moments of everything that happens, and let just Kurt Cobain's personal art and his personal lyrics and everything that he went into, everything that he documented for himself was put into the film, and that was what drove the film where it went. And I think, without spoiling too much, it's something special. It's a very special documentary that I really encourage people to watch. Now, if I had to point out any negatives that I really did not like with the documentary, first off, I think the documentary, as much as I appreciate it, I think drove itself too far in his music, which I think was expected. I mean, it's a Kurt Cobain documentary. You're expected to hear a lot of Nirvana music, but I think for large chunks of the doc, that it feels like it's encouraged mostly through music and music videos that we've seen in the past. And I guess, coming from a Nirvana fan, I guess that's expected, because at this point in time, there's been so much shown of the guy and shown of the band that you don't necessarily get to see every day, that you get to see in stages of the past couple of decades, that it's kind of expected that you've seen things that you've already seen and you want to see something new. And that's kind of like the wall that this documentary kind of comes in, especially for a viewer like me. So that's kind of a negative. Another negative was showing, I guess, Kurt and Courtney on drugs, which is very hard to watch, because it's like, as much as you like the guy, you kind of hate the guy at the same time for watching him take care of his kid on drugs. It's very unfortunate to watch, and especially for something that happened a long time ago, it still feels fresh because it's something you've never seen before. So because it's that kind of moment, you just feel like, God, what an incredible douchebag for doing such a thing. And it's almost like a 180, because it's like, why am I saying that to someone who I really idolized? It's a very strange thing, and as much as I loved it, I also kind of hated it, which I think is a good thing for the doc. And of course, also, I really would have really enjoyed if we got Frances, Kurt Cobain's daughter's personal thoughts on the documentary, or just the process of making it, because granted, she's an off-camera kind of person, and she's not really into that kind of scene of being known for, I guess, being the child of Kurt. And I get that, and I understand that she's not into the famous scene that, like, most people are into, especially children who are, famous for being for being children of big stars. I mean, it happens a lot, but I just feel like there's not really a definitive, like, on-screen documentation of her personal thoughts on her father in general, that I guess I would have wanted her to just say something. I'm not saying she had to have an extensive, like, overall interview, because at the end of the day, most of the interviews that are in the documentary aren't really that long and extensive in and of itself, so it just would have been nice if she was on screen talking about her dad and or something. I mean, granted, she was a baby, and you don't really have the same kind of perception of experiencing having a father figure when you're a baby. I get that, but at the same time, when so much time has passed, and you're having this being, the definitive Kurt Cobain documentary, if you will, which it's what it's being practically called, which I actually would consider it to be, it would have just been nice for her to not only back the film, which she did, which I really appreciate, because a lot that went into the documentary itself would not have been if it was for her. Like, Frances put a lot into this film, and as much as I appreciate her for doing that and give her a humongous shout out for doing so, I still feel that it would have been nice for her to have some kind of on-screen presence in the film itself, other than her baby home video footage, which was good also. But I just feel like it would have just been interesting to get her thoughts two decades later on everything that went down, if you will. I mean, regardless of because the documentary is supposed to be real, which it does get down and dirty with, the realities of what happened with him through life. It just would have been nice to get her personal issues out there in the documentary itself. But I guess at the end of the day, it's a story about Kurt, and she was not a part of it to a certain extent. As I guess as mean or dark as that sounds, it's kind of true. So I guess at the end of the day, it makes sense. But as a hardcore fan who doesn't get to see this kind of stuff all the time, it would have been nice to just get that in and of itself at the end of the day. But over the course of this documentary, we get a lot of awesome, incredible stuff. Check out the documentary. I'm pretty sure you can check it out online or check it out on HBO's On Demand or what have you. And I'm pretty sure it's going to be out on Blu-ray pretty soon anyways. So definitely check it out if you've not seen it already. Kurt Cobain, Montage of Heck, amazing documentary. I give it a good 9 out of 10. It was an amazing documentary. I loved it. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. What terrible grammar. I enjoyed it. It was an incredible, moving documentary. Hope you guys enjoyed. Comment below. Let me know what you personally thought about the documentary if you've seen it already. What are your personal thoughts on everything that went down within the documentary? Subscribe to my channel if you've not done so already. This has been John 12.